Raika, Koyman, those names you know. So we'll be getting started, and in the interest of time, I will go straight to him to make his presentation, and then I will ask Dr. Siuta, Dr. Agustin Viana, Dr. Anibal Mblalango, and Dr. Marcelina to make comments. And then I will open up for the Q&A, and we will have the debate, which will depend on how many questions and how much that takes. Some of the questions will be from our chat box, from the Facebook. So not all questions you will be able to see from the chat box of the Zoom here, because I will import some questions from the Facebook chat box. So I will get started now. Podemos ir para lá? Podemos?
Do I need to do anything to get the English translation?
We do have. You don't need that. There is a simultaneous translation. You just speak.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our international series of webinars on the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Today's session, it focuses on Suriname. Suriname is a country in the global south. It's in the South American country, and it is a peer country to Moçambique. The Surinamese, they are blessed with natural resources, but they have taken a different path for the management of the wealth coming from those resources. They did not opt for a sovereign wealthy fund. So today, we will hear Professor Hourt. Professor Hourt is a professor of international political economy at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. If you want to have a global perspective on policy options, the best person you can have to look into some of these countries is indeed Professor Hourt. He has written, he has published extensively in this subject, and because of the ties between the Netherlands and Suriname, he has studied Suriname's case, and he will be sharing his experience with us today. This international webinar series is on the Wealth Sovereign Fund, but it is important for newcomers like Moçambique in this field, not only to listen to the experiences of those countries that have taken the path of Wealth Sovereign Fund, but also to listen to those countries, to peer countries that have opted for a different policy option, and to see how can learn from that in order to make informed decisions on the management of their of our wealth sovereign fund in this case. Today, we have Professor Hourt. We will also have Michiel van de Pompe. He is the Deputy Ambassador at the NL Embassy here in Maputo. He is attending another meeting. He will join us as we progress. We also have Dr. Moises Yuda. He is from ES. He is here today representing the forum or the Budget Monitor Forum. We also have Dr. Agustin Viana, who represents the platform of civil society for extractive industries. And we have our partners, namely Dr. Marcelina as well. She's the representative of the Ministry of Mineral Resources and Energy. And we have Dr. Anibal Mblalango, who is from the tax authority. Without further ado, I'm going directly to ask Professor Hourt to make this presentation. Over to you, Professor Hourt.
Okay, well, thanks, Adriano, for this, and it's nice to see you again. I wanted to share my presentation, my PowerPoint presentation, but apparently the share screen option is not functioning. So is it possible to switch that on? I now see it. So I hope this is visible for you. Is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Then I can just go through the presentation that I prepared for this occasion. Yes, I'm happy to be here to give a presentation on, as indeed you were saying, Suriname, in particular its state oil company. And as a matter of fact, I have been teaching in Suriname, which is located in the northeastern part of South America, for about 18 years. And I visited the country quite regularly, and I've also taken up an interest in the country and found the state oil company a very suitable case study, actually, to illustrate some of the political economy arguments that we are working on at my institute. So I've titled the presentation "Confidence in Our Own Abilities," and this is in quotation marks because this has been the slogan of the Surinamese state oil company since 1980. My presentation actually is reflected also in a number of publications that I wrote. A first one, an initial one in 2007, which was published in the Journal of Development Studies, and a later updated version of this in a book edited by Michael Roll on public sector performance. And I'm going to take you through some observations on the state oil company of Suriname, and I will, towards the end, touch on the sovereign wealth fund. Because as Adriana was just saying, indeed, Suriname has not implemented a sovereign wealth fund, but due to certain developments, and I will get back to them as I go, the issue of a sovereign wealth fund has come into the discussion relatively recently. So in that sense, but this is where maybe the histories of Suriname and Mozambique and that of other countries may run in parallel in the future. The Sovereign Wealth Fund is coming onto the agenda. In my writing on the state oil company, I've basically touched on a number of different concepts and writings, and I'm not going to expand on them very extensively today, but if it's useful for the discussion, we may actually return to them at a later stage. So concepts that I've been working with are those of developmental, rentier, and predatory states. These are different concepts, very well known in the literature on development and political economy. And they basically are the expression of particular choices that have been made under certain restrictions in various parts of the developing world. Another concept that I've been working with is that of rent seeking. And here, particularly rent seeking in situations of unearned income. And natural resources are a major source of rents. And the final concept that comes through is that of pockets of efficiency. So the term pockets of efficiency was introduced in the literature to denote actually institutions operating in a, let's call it, non-developmental context. So for instance, in rentier states that are very very dependent on earnings from natural resources, to implement particular policies in a relatively effective way. And the authors that I'm drawing on theoretically are people like Peter Evans, whose book Dependent Development was a major source of thinking. Barbara Geddes, who worked a lot on countries in Latin America, and particularly here her book Politician's Dilemma is important. Mick Moore, at a sister institute of the ISS, namely the Institute for Development Studies in Sussex, and David Leonard, who came up with a modern version of the notion of the pockets of efficiency in his book African Successes. So this is, let's say, my inspiration. But let me turn to the context. The context of Suriname is to be summarized in a number of keywords. First of all, it has been what you could call a non-developmental rent-seeking state, in the sense that it was, as Adriana already alluded to, always a very resource-dependent country. The earnings from the natural resources have not been used so much for developmental purposes, but basically for the guarantee of support to the politicians in power, and also to provide certain, let's call it, services for the population at large. So this is a very highly resource dependent country. Actually, the main 3 or 4 sources of income are all natural resources. So it used to be bauxite for a long time. Now bauxite mining has stopped, but in the past it constituted maybe 40% of total gross domestic product. A second main source of income at the moment is gold, not unimportant. A third one has always been timber, also because this is a country with 90% of its soil covered by by rainforest. And fourthly, since the 1980s, oil. So it's highly resource dependent. And over its history, and certainly since its independence in 1975, before that it was a colony of the Netherlands, it's been characterized by a negligible degree of industrialization. So there is some industrialization, and importantly, and I will come to that later, tied to the oil industry. So the state oil company here is one of the few sources of industrialization. But apart from that, it's mainly related to natural resources and the semi-products produced on the basis of natural resource extraction. Further, the country has been, and that's tied to this notion of rent-seeking, the country has known an extreme growth of the public sector. So at the moment of total employed persons, probably 50% somehow is working in direct government position or in a position that is tied very much to the public sector. So it's a very big public sector. Interestingly, the country, apart from a few years of military rule in the 1980s, has been a political democracy. This goes back to the colonial period, where in the 1920s, I believe, a sort of representation was introduced on a limited extent. But it's been extended definitely since the 1950s, and we can characterize the country as a fairly open democratic political system. Yet, and it's also been stable, with the exception then of the military coup in 1980 and the military period that ran for about 7 years. But it's been run on the basis of ethnic balancing. So you see a lot of signs of ethnic balancing. And here on the picture is the statue of one of the major leaders of the African Surinamese part of the population, Pengel. And his name now also is attached to the national airport. Okay, so let's go to the bulk of the presentation. This gives you a little bit of background to the country and its major development problems. The State Oil Company. And let me start out with a little bit of history. The State Oil Company was founded in 1980. So this was during the military period. And partly the ideology of self-reliance that was then embraced also under the military government led to the setting up of an oil industry. There was oil found a couple of years before, and they started drilling for oil, as in the picture here. At first, production was very, very limited. But they had a very enthusiastic and dynamic geologist trained at Leiden. Obviously, the colonial history here is also visible. By name of Eddie Jarrab. So he was he is an Indian Surinamese. So from a different ethnic background than the leader that I just showed you. He was the first director, and he was a geologist. He was trained geologist, and he set up the company and ran it for the first 25 years of its existence, so until 2005. And actually, he led it to its growth. You can say that these foundation years, these 25 first years, were very important. And since Jarrab, the company's had two other directors, And these other directors, and I emphasize that here because it'll come back later in the story, were recruited from inside the firm. The task of the state-owned company was actually in initial phases twofold. It was to explore petroleum and it was to exploit. So it was to drill for petroleum. And its evolution showed a very gradual development. So in the 1990s, the construction of a refinery was started. In the 2010s, the second phase of the refinery was finished. And this refinery currently produces 6 million barrels of refined oil in 2019. So by international standards, this is small. This is actually very small. But for a country of about 500,000, 600,000 inhabitants, this is quite significant. And a sign of its success was also its diversification. So at the moment, the bulk of the production, and this is part of the industrialization strategy here, is the production of ultra-low sulfur diesel and gasoline next to crude oil. And so you can say that the state oil company has diversified its production away from just providing crude oil to the international market. And another indication of the success was that the country, and again I must underline that this is a small country, at least in terms of population, 500,000-600,000 people. The country achieves energy self-sufficiency as of 2001, and that is not a minor achievement. Since a number of years, the company, which in Dutch is called Staatsolie, State Oil Company, is active in electricity production. So this is a further step in terms of the diversification. It also, in 2019, took over the local hydropower dam, and it has been involved in 3 major offshore oil discoveries in 2020. So let me turn to that latest development. There were 3 recent offshore oil discoveries. This has led, 2020 was an election year. We can maybe talk about that later if that's relevant. This led to the discourse of Suriname as a new Qatar. Now, this is, of course, an overstatement, but you can imagine the sort of excitement that the discovery of oil actually produced. So if we look at the offshore area, down to the bottom is the coast, and then you see this is the sort of, I think that's called the continental shelf of Suriname. And in recent years, in one of the blocks, Block 58, which is here, 3 oil discoveries were made. Expectation obviously is, also since neighboring Guyana has also discovered quite significant oil reserves, that also in other blocks there will be more oil to be found. The state oil company takes up a maximum of 20% participation in the production by 2 foreign firms, Apache Corporation from Canada and Total, which is a French based oil company. The state oil company gets overall between 60 to 75% of the revenues of the oil that is being drilled. Total revenues expected in the next 20 years, at least when the exploitation will start, will amount to roughly 10 to 15 billion US dollars, depending, of course, on the oil price. And currently, and that's what I alluded to earlier, there is a discussion on the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. For the same reasons why it's being discussed everywhere, namely that you want to use the revenues, these 10 to 15 billion US dollars in revenues, you want to use them for productive and developmental purposes. So when I present you with some data over the last decades, then you will see immediately how significant actually and how successful the company has been. Let's turn to a first graph that gives you an overview of its achievements. Now, obviously here you see, particularly if you go to the right-hand side of the graph, a major plunge in around 2014, 2015. This was the time when the oil prices plummeted. So that's been a major crisis in the corporation. But if we look at the period, but this is largely exogenous development, and this is due to the international market developments, and as such has not so much to do with the company itself. So if we focus on the high year, the high end here, so 2011, 2012, 2013, you see that the black line is the gross revenues. These amounted to over 1 billion US dollars per year. Net profit was significant. At its highest, 2012, amounted to roughly 400 million US dollars in that year. They also made significant investments. So you see that the green line almost equaling or surpassing the profits. So you see that the company has been investing quite significantly over the last couple of years. Then the red line is the so-called shareholders' equity. So that is the value of the company for the state. So the state, and unfortunately data have not been available after 2016, the Surinamese state, the Surinamese government, owns roughly 1.1 billion in shares in the state oil company. Another graph is that of the company's return on investment, and the importance here is that, with the exception again of the slump starting in 2012, 2013, the return on investment for the company has been quite stable, or at least significant. Not so much stable. You see also a dip in the late 1990s, also when the oil prices went down. This is the period of the Asian financial crisis. But before that, and in the sort of early 20th century, you see significant returns on investment. And then finally, and this is, let's say, the significance of the company to the country, you see also that the contribution of the state oil company as one single company to gross domestic product has gone up quite significantly. So to over 20%, so 1/5 of total GDP in the early 2010s was produced by this state oil company. And of course that's gone down because of the fall in world oil prices. But it is to be expected that certainly with the exploitation of oil from the continental shelf, the contribution will go up again. Now, why has the company been successful? And this is actually my link to the notion of pocket of effectiveness. So the company has existed within quite a rentier-oriented country. That means that most of the revenues, for instance, of the bauxite production, have traditionally been used for consumptive purposes. And the government has spent quite significantly, has recruited great numbers of people to the public service to guarantee political support and all that. And yet, in this context, the state oil company has been able to escape from that grip. And they have been able to set up an independent company that within this country started to function as one of the best run companies in the private sector. So that is a major paradox. And my contributions to the literature actually focused on that. How can we explain that paradox? Well, that paradox is a seeming contradiction. So why is it a seeming contradiction? Well, it's not so much a riddle. If we look at two major factors. First is the internal management of the company. And this is a picture of Jarup, as I said, the geologist, founder and general director of the state oil company between 1980 and 2005. The idea from the outset was that the company should be built on its own capacities. So the principle for Jarup was to develop management capacities in association, first of all, with Gulf oil, but without becoming dependent. So Jarup always described this as a master-apprentice relationship. People from Gulf were brought in as consultants, and they were requested to train people on the ground in the kinds of tasks that they were requested to do. So this led to the acquisition of technical know-how, where it's probably no exaggeration to say that maybe in 1980 about 5 people had the technical know-how to be involved in oil exploration or exploitation. And at the moment, the company employs a couple of thousand people, all at quite high levels of expertise. One of the principles was the adoption of a meritocratic human resource policy. Jarup always resisted the idea of ethnically based hiring. So he said, I don't care whether somebody is African Surinamese, Indian Surinamese, Chinese Surinamese, or Indian, that means indigenous. As long as they can do their job, they can get a job at the state oil company. So he went away from the ethnically based hiring, which constantly was a problem in the other sectors. So, for instance, the bauxite industry was always very much determined by the African Surinamese group. Then also, with regard to the management of the oil industry, he opted for the conclusion of so-called production sharing agreements. And he very much resisted the giving out of concessions. That was one of the lessons that he drew from the bauxite sector, where actually already in the 1930s, 1940s, massive concessions had been given to firms from the US, like Alcoa, and from the Netherlands, like Shell Billiton. So the idea here was to set up production sharing agreements where actually the oil was possessed by the state oil company, but the revenues of the production would be shared with others. Now, this is something that is translated also in the current situation, where with the offshore oil discoveries, a particular share of the revenues will be going to the two companies that I just mentioned, Apache and Total, but the majority share will be remaining with the state oil company of Suriname. So 60 to 75% of total revenue will remain in the country. And this was all done under, and that's why I termed my presentation Confidence in Our Own Abilities. This was all done under the motto of confidence in our own abilities. So the idea that this had to be a bottom-up, self-induced process of development. And you could say that this is a bit avant la lettre resource nationalism. So that's a term that's currently being used in Latin America and also elsewhere for countries that focus very much on national ownership of resources. The state oil company from the 1980s onwards was very much based on an early notion of resource nationalism. So in terms of the internal management, this was a key part of the state oil company strategy. So this is part of what I call a double strategy. Now, the second part of the double strategy was the relations with government. And here you see a couple of pictures of the Independence Square in Paramaribo, the capital city of the country, with at the top the presidential palace on the left-hand side, and then on the bottom the Ministry of Finance. These were both buildings dating back to the Dutch colonial period, as you may see from the architecture. But what's important here is that from the early days, there was the conviction that the company had to keep out of politics. This was easier said than done, because as I say, the company gradually grew into a major source of income for the government. And it was also clear that it could be an important motor for employment. So it could be used for patronage purposes very, very easily. This is something that certainly the leadership from the beginning has resisted very clearly. And it did that, for instance, by emphasizing its legal independence. The company was set up as a limited company. So although it is a state-owned enterprise in a formal sense, it is not directed as a state-owned enterprise. It's directed as a limited company. And that was done very much on purpose in order to guarantee the arm's length relationship to the government. So yes, there is a supervisory board, which is appointed by the shareholder, the government of Suriname, but that supervisory board does not have direct influence on the policy of the company. And that's already been made clear at various stages during the existence of the company. I will come to one example in a minute. One of the main tools in retaining that distance to government was to rely on commercial funding. ABN AMRO used an office has been the major support financially for the company. So Jarab, as the first director, resisted the recourse to state investment. He said, I'd rather pay 3 or 4% more on interest to go to ABN AMRO rather than becoming dependent on the state. Undoubtedly, a very important element here was the maintenance of good working relations with the government. As I already in an earlier graph showed, there were significant profits made, and apart from the share that was used to invest, always part of the profits were used to reinvest, the rest of the profits have all been transferred to the state. So over time, the state oil company has been a very important source of interest for the Ministry of Finance. And it is demonstrated by an example from 1998. The then government, and you may remember that I said 1997, 1998 was a tough year because the oil prices went down. And at that time, the government was in dire straits. There was a financial crisis, and there was a lot of pressure to sell the state oil company to a Korean firm. And since the government at that time was accused of having ulterior motives, like corruption, they could use part of the income from the sale of the state oil company to Daewoo, actually it was the Korean firm, for their own purposes. There was a massive uprising. The streets were full, and the state oil company's workers' union really played an important role in mobilizing social support. So this pressure to sell the company off into foreign hands was resisted very successfully, and actually led to the stepping down of the then president. Also, one of the elements in that relationship to the government was the resistance, and successful resistance, I must say, against the piloting of senior management by the parties in power. So it was tried a couple of times, but as until now, all senior management was appointed on the basis of merit, and was appointed usually from within the company. Not always, of course, but it's never been detrimental to the whole existence of the firm. So this is, in a nutshell, actually the story of the state oil company. So let me turn to a couple of conclusions. My main conclusion, but this is a very academic conclusion, and I won't go very much into detail here, is that my meso-analysis shows that the patrimonial system that's in place in the country, which leads to basically the usage of the public sector for support to the main parties in power, does not prevent the creation of so-called pockets of effectiveness, pockets of efficiency. The terms are being used interchangeably. But also, I would say the success of a pocket of efficiency depends on certain necessary conditions. First of all, a pocket of efficiency. Here, the example is the state oil company. Others have used, for instance, the Brazilian Development Bank in the 1960s and 70s as an example. But this relies very much on the autonomy vis-à-vis the government and the maintenance of that autonomy. And that is a major struggle in itself. And secondly, a very important condition here is that of the building of an enterprise on own abilities with very limited dependence on foreign capital. Now, the question comes up with these new oil discoveries, and particularly with the expectation that that might bring in, on the basis of these three sources that have now been discovered. And so imagine what would happen if another 3 or 6 or 9 would be discovered, then the amount of revenue that would be flowing in would be increased enormously. And so now expectations are that this would be between 10 and 15 billion US dollars in the next 20 years. But with these new oil discoveries, there might be a risk of politicization of the company. So the question here, very importantly, is who controls the wealth? And this is actually why, and I already alluded to this a couple of times now, the creation of a sovereign wealth fund is being put into the discussion. The current director of the state oil company, who's going to retire actually at the end of the year because he's reaching the age of 60, so they have a very low retirement age, certainly compared to a country like the Netherlands. But he floated the idea of the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. And so that would mean, if this is agreed, that a sizable share of the revenues of the offshore oil production would go into such a wealth fund for use at a particular moment in time for productive purposes. And then final point is that also around this discussion of control of wealth, the privatization of the company remains an option. And this is also a solution that's been found in many different contexts. Privatization with the state as a minority shareholder, possibly. And this is definitely not something that's gotten great support at the moment, but it is definitely one of the options in the maintenance of this arm's length relationship of the state oil company to the government. So here I come to the end of the presentation, and I hope that I've given you a bit of a bird's eye overview of how the company has functioned, what its major achievements have been, and what also the challenges are for the future. So Adriano, over to you. We can't hear you. We can't still hear you. You're still on mute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Hourt, for this brilliant and challenging presentation. It is indeed challenging to hear that there is a possibility of pockets of efficiency in a context of non-developmental patrimonial state. That is quite challenging, Professor. And I think that speaks to one of your books, together with Dick, the Australian professor. This notion of embedded autonomy. And when we open to the Q&A, I would want to hear from you. Do you think that this is possible in the African context? Because this is exactly what we're talking about. This is what we're looking for. This is exactly what we're looking for. And you yourself, you know Mozambique, you have been here a couple of times implementing a good governance and public administration program. So Mozambique is familiar to you, and you are making a case of a possibility of pockets of efficiency in a context of a non-developmental patrimonial rentier state. Do you see that happening? Mozambique is highly dependent, moved from aid dependence, and that was stopped, not because Mozambique has graduated, but aid was stopped because of bad governance, particularly corruption, political level corruption. So it is challenging to see that you have a political leadership in Suriname that would allow that sort of embedded autonomy of their state or oil company in order to be efficient the way you have brilliantly described it. I'm really curious to hear a bit more how that came into being. How did they move? What was the game changer for the culture that has led to the bauxite company that was more consistent with the culture of a non-developmental and rentier state? So, what was the game changer? What was it? What happened to the country in order for the political elites to allow? This is the question that we have been struggling with in Mozambique and throughout Africa. Political leadership in Africa is non-developmental, is corrupt, is short-time horizon, and we have been looking into these sparkles. What is it that can break that path and go developmental and allow these pockets of efficiency? But I'm only the moderator. So I will invite my discussants to comment. For the sake of gender justice, and in fact our panel is already non-balanced in terms of gender. So please allow me to change the order in order to address some of the more sensitive issues related to the gender justice. So allow me to invite first Dr. Marcelina as well. Over to you, Dr. Marcelina as well. Dr. Marcelina as well.
I'm sorry, I was muted.
Okay, please, over to you.
First of all, I would like to thank our main speaker, Professor Will, and for the presentation, a very comprehensive presentation, and also a very useful comments throughout his presentation. I think it was clear that the political willing was very important for this company to perform its role and also to succeed. But I have got also some questions on that, on the performance and also some of the management of the companies. Maybe as the first question, I would like to ask how the company was funded, because as you said, as you mentioned, if I did understand well, they used less funds. It was less funded outside. It means that there was some source that I could not get if it was revenues from government or the company generated the funds itself. And also how the company is started. I could not understand because some of the companies, some of the countries, mainly in the oil companies development or oil sector development, they always have started from those multinational companies like Shell, BP, Exxon, and so on. And later on, after they gain experience, know-how, and also after training of their national locals to drive the company, to drive the business. Then they used several mechanisms. For instance, the Saudi Arabia, there was all these big multinational companies in the beginning, but after somehow they have compensated that companies. There was agreement to compensate that companies. And I understand that one of those roles or mechanism of compensation was the Bahrain island that was given to those companies in addition to the amount that was given for them to compensate them, so that the Saudi Arabia state has gained the control of the oil sector. That is what we had from the experience that we had on our several trips to exchange to Saudi Arabia. So I would like to know how that this Statoil company, or Suriname Statoil company, did start. And maybe another question was how much that company keeps to reinvest. Is all revenues generated from that company channeled to the government, state budget, or this company is allowed to keep some amount to reinvest? And also, because I heard that this was a limited company that was set up, and they have like a board where some people, maybe from the government, were part of the board, but they did not have at all any influence on the real management of the company and the decision maker on how the investment should be done in the company. So maybe if you could share with us that experience based on that questions I have raised, I would appreciate, and maybe later on I can come up with other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcelina as well. I will go now to Dr. Anibal Mblalango. Dr. Anibal Mblalango?
Sim. Primeiro, cumprimentar a todos que estão aqui neste debate, principalmente ao professor Will, por ter nos trazido essa experiência deste país, Suriname, e tendo em conta aquilo que é a realidade do país e também aquilo que tem feito relativamente às operações petrolíferas. Eu penso que quando nós estamos a falar de operações petrolíferas, temos de ver primeiro as partes envolvidas. Nós temos duas partes públicas com ordenamento jurídico próprio. Dito isto, seria importante perceber como é que se faz esta gestão da participação do Estado. Nos contratos que os Estados celebram, eles geralmente colocam uma entidade que participa em seu nome para a realização das operações petrolíferas. É o caso aqui da nossa empresa moçambicana, no caso de Moçambique, é a Empresa Moçambicana de Hidrocarbonetos, que é ela que basicamente garante o acesso dos recursos, deve garantir o acesso dos recursos petrolíferos para o Estado e também aumentar as receitas do mesmo Estado. Deve se envolver nas operações e também deve ajudar no controle, na supervisão das operações. Também, em alguns países, essas empresas têm a função de consolidação da industrialização, portanto, elas devem participar promovendo o financiamento público para a industrialização dos países. Devem também, essas empresas públicas, diversificar o portfólio de investimentos, tendo em conta os setores que têm maior demanda. Portanto, é função de uma empresa pública de petróleos ver quais são as áreas que carecem de investimento e também e promover esse investimento com base nos recursos que vai obtendo do setor de petróleos. Mas também deve consolidar o papel do Estado de produtor de estratégias econômicas e garantir a sustentabilidade de energia, de fontes de energia, no caso, energias não renováveis, como é o caso do petróleo e do gás. Também estas todas as atribuições nós podemos encontrar naquilo que é o Estatuto da Empresa Nacional de Hidrocarbonetos. Basicamente, a Empresa Nacional de Hidrocarbonetos, a NH, em Moçambique, tem por objeto realizar essas todas ações que nós nos referimos aqui. E para tal, ela é organizada, tem um conselho de administração, que é nomeado pelos acionistas. O acionista da empresa pública é o Estado, e este conselho de administrações tem competências e atribuições específicas para materializar esse objetivo. E o Estado, de forma clara, já define, no caso do nosso país, através deste decreto número 29/2015, de 28 de dezembro, o que é que esta nossa empresa pública deve fazer e como é que ela deve se governar, e relativamente também à prestação de contas, como é que deve prestar as contas, como é que deve fazer os seus investimentos. Penso que, em termos de quadro legal para o funcionamento de uma empresa pública do setor de petróleos, Moçambique já estabeleceu. Tem também mecanismos de controle no que diz respeito à prestação de contas. A própria lei já atribui essas funções, estabelece como é que devem ser usadas, quais e como devem ser usadas as receitas que esta empresa tem. E também esta empresa é autorizada a criar subsidiárias, porque ela não pode, ela mesmo sendo empresa pública, ela tem que se especializar em função de projetos ou de áreas de investimento em que ela pretende participar. E a própria lei também já autoriza esta nossa empresa pública para que tenha subsidiárias ou empresas específicas que vão gerir o portfólio de investimentos da nossa empresa pública. Relativamente à participação, nós fomos compulsar as contas gerais do Estado de 2015 a 2019 e vimos que as subsidiárias da Empresa Nacional de Hidrocarbonetos têm dado dividendos ao Estado. Estamos a falar em 2015 de 23%, 2016 2,6%, 2017 1,9%, 2018 3,7%, e em 2019 tivemos cerca de 10,8% daquilo que é o portfólio de dividendos que o Estado moçambicano está a receber, portanto, de forma indireta, porque a CMH é detida em 70% pela NH, portanto, significa que os propósitos para os quais esta empresa pública moçambicana foram criados estão a ser realizados, e também esta empresa tem feito prestação de contas por via da publicação dos seus relatórios de conta e também através das auditorias que são feitas tanto pela autoridade tributária, assim como pela Inspeção Geral de Finanças, uma vez que ela está a defender os interesses do Estado. E penso que nesta primeira abordagem, quanto à nossa empresa, eu ia parar por aqui e também dizer que, de facto, é impressionante um país, Suriname, e infelizmente está há muito tempo nesse setor de petróleos, ainda não tem um fundo soberano estabelecido. Agora teve descobertas que, segundo o professor, irão colocá-la como um dos maiores atrativos do setor energético mundial. Portanto, é urgente a criação eventualmente, de mecanismos de garantia de partilha destes recursos com as gerações vindouras. Obrigado.
Dr. Moisés Ciuta.
Boa tarde. Bom, muito obrigado a todos e em particular ao professor Will. Bem, eu vou tentar ser breve E em relação à apresentação, o que eu inicio aqui é a partir do primeiro slide. Eu vi que o professor Will colocou lá uma coisa que nos faz lembrar um pouco sobre Moçambique, que é que o slogan da empresa de petróleo gera confidence in our own abilities, o que me faz pensar um pouco na expressão contar com as próprias forças. Então, a pergunta é: qual é a diferença que existe entre Moçambique e Suriname? Né? Que lições aqui podemos extrair, tendo em conta os contextos diferentes que os dois países têm? Bom, por um lado, primeiro, a população, qual é o tamanho de Suriname? Suriname é um país com cerca de 500 mil habitantes, ou seja, metade da província de Maputo. E Moçambique tem 30 milhões de habitantes. E isso já dá uma ideia como é que é possível que uma única empresa tenha capacidade de fazer o que está a fazer no país em que está. E o que poderia ser muito difícil, pensar numa mega empresa em Moçambique que tivesse capacidade de gerir e garantir intervenções em setores estratégicos para o desenvolvimento num país todo. Então, é perceptível aqui que uma empresa tenha um papel preponderante para o tamanho da população que tem. Agora, vamos lá, o PIB per capita. Qual é o PIB per capita de Moçambique e qual é o PIB per capita de Suriname? O PIB per capita de Moçambique é de cerca de $1.200, que é muito baixo quando comparado com o PIB per capita do Suriname. Agora, isso faz pensar como explicar, por exemplo, o sucesso da empresa de petróleos em Suriname e o sucesso do nosso estado cá. E também faz pensar se vale a pena nós defendermos, num contexto moçambicano, uma maior estatização da economia e assumindo todos os problemas que existem no seio político e de gestão que o professor Nuvunga fez menção no início. No IES, temos feito uma pesquisa dedicada à poupança doméstica, ou seja, qual é a relevância que a poupança doméstica tem na economia, não só de Moçambique, mas de outros países. A primeira constatação foi que Moçambique não poupa, investe tudo, gasta tudo que produz e deixa muito pouco para fazer investimentos, como os investimentos que foram feitos, são feitos no Suriname. Eu fui buscar os dados da Penwall Tables para trazer um resumo da situação de poupanças e investimento e comparar Moçambique com Suriname. Em 2010, a poupança de Suriname era de 41%. O investimento era de 35%. Significa que o investimento era baseado na poupança que Suriname tinha. O que é diferente de Moçambique. Moçambique, em 2010, tinha uma poupança só de 7% e um investimento de 18% do PIB. Em 2017, nós vimos uma situação ainda similar. O investimento aumentou em Moçambique para 61% e a poupança doméstica aumentou para 61%. Ou seja, foi-se buscar muito mais recursos da poupança dos outros do que usar a nossa própria poupança. O que ainda é um contraste com Suriname, porque a poupança de Suriname em 2017 Portanto, a afirmação do professor Will de que Suriname procura confiar na sua própria habilidade é certa, o que constitui um contraste enorme com Moçambique, que a aposta tem que sido usar a poupança dos outros. É claro, se enquanto for o caminho seguido em Moçambique, o caminho seguido em Moçambique for confiar nas forças dos outros, nós vamos ter situações que atrasam o processo de desenvolvimento. Por um lado, um crescimento do déficit público, que agora ronda os 80% do PIB, que ronda os 80% a relação entre as receitas e as despesas do Estado, que um déficit orçamental de cerca de 80%. E, por outro lado, nós vamos ter situações como as que o professor Novunga fez menção, de corrupção e de má gestão, porque todo mundo vai lutar por recursos não nossos, mas por gerir recursos que são dos outros. Então, é aqui onde este ponto fica interessante. Agora, a pergunta é se temos que ter fundo soberano ou não, se temos que seguir o exemplo de Suriname e ter uma mega empresa. Eu tenho uma opinião pessoal, que é Moçambique só pode ter fundo soberano se houver definições do que ele vai fazer. E o objetivo for mudar a estratégia de desenvolvimento e crescimento atual, que é deixar de contar com as forças dos outros para contar com as nossas próprias forças. Se o objetivo for esse, e se criar mecanismos para que isso aconteça. Pois, pelo contrário, não vale a pena. Há vários países que tiveram fundo soberano. O Brasil fechou o fundo soberano. E a Angola tem um fundo que tem e tem os problemas de má gestão e continua na situação em que está. Então, definir mecanismos práticos para garantir o sucesso do fundo soberano é uma coisa importantíssima para conseguir que uma coisa como o fundo soberano sirva para o desenvolvimento do país. Agora, ir pelas empresas estatais também tem um outro desafio. Não é? Temos várias empresas aqui em Moçambique que a gestão do Estado demonstra que nós não estamos ainda capacitados para termos um exemplo, que ainda que numa dimensão menor o Suriname tem. Por exemplo, vamos lá, a Petromoc, a EDM, a STDM, a MCL, são algumas empresas estatais que mostram qual seria, num cenário como o do Suriname, a situação em que estaríamos hoje. Não é? Empresas que ficam ou na falência técnica ou simplesmente têm de fechar porque a gestão não permite que sejam lucrativas e que beneficiem o país. Eu vou ficar por aqui e muito obrigado pelo espaço. Não consigo ver o professor Novunga aí. Ainda está aí?
Meu caro Dr. Moisés Ciuta, muito obrigado. Dr. Agostinho Viana, por favor. Dr. Viana?
Está sim, boa tarde.
Por favor.
Ok, muito obrigado pela palavra. Dizia que quero saudar antes o painel e endereçar ao professor Will o nosso agradecimento por essa disponibilidade em partilhar a experiência de Suriname conosco e juntos refletirmos em torno do futuro da indústria extrativa, concretamente a participação da Empresa Estatal de Hidrocarbonetos em Moçambique e os seus impactos. O professor tocou aqui alguns pontos que, de facto, constitui uma preocupação para nós como membros da plataforma da indústria extrativa, como membros da organização da sociedade civil, cá na província de Niassa, que diz respeito mesmo com a questão da autonomia das empresas estatais e a dependência limitada do capital estrangeiro. É uma preocupação muito forte nossa, porque existem algumas constatações que são levantadas a nível da indústria extrativa que não nos deixam com alguma segurança quanto à participação das empresas estatais de exploração, nos projetos de exploração de hidrocarbonetos no país. Gostaria de trazer aqui 4 pontos. O primeiro aspecto tem muito a ver com a expectativa generalizada que a comunidade moçambicana, em particular da província de Niassa, tem com a exploração dos hidrocarbonetos no país. Espera-se que, com o início da exploração, as condições de vida dos moçambicanos comecem a mudar, né? E, no entanto, nós temos visto uma tendência do governo de buscar investimentos ou atrair investimentos para determinadas zonas, os chamados polos de desenvolvimento, como é o caso da cidade de Maputo, de Tete, Nacala, Porto, Quelimane e Pemba. Eu falo de uma província que situa-se ao norte do país e ela é bastante rica em recursos minerais e em terras férteis, mas, no entanto, ela é sedenta de investimentos, sobretudo investimento público. E, por isso, ela é tida como a província mais pobre do país. Há um tipo de exploração de recursos minerais, mas que é uma exploração, na sua maior parte, ilegal, que é exercida por indivíduos estrangeiros. Daí que seria um pouco penoso assumir que esses recursos estariam ao serviço destas comunidades. Então, há um sentimento de abandono. Com esta tendência do governo de atrair investimento para determinadas zonas, há, de fato, uma grande preocupação. O segundo ponto que gostaria de fazer menção tem mesmo a ver com a capacidade financeira da empresa estatal de hidrocarbonetos em garantir a sua participação no setor de hidrocarbonetos. Nota-se que a participação do Estado neste setor é maioritariamente assegurada por empréstimo ou endividamento. E isto não é muito bem visto por alguns analistas, na medida que ela demonstra uma tendência crescente. E isto pode pôr em risco, sim, os propósitos da participação destas empresas neste setor. E isso vem contradizer um pouco este que é o argumento do colega Anibal, que dizia que, de facto, a empresa, a ENH, está a alcançar aqueles que foram os propósitos pelos quais foi criada. Só queria referenciar aqui só 2 estudos. Um dos estudos é do CIP, que dá conta que a participação da Empresa Estatal de Hidrocarbonetos no projeto Coral Sul da Área 4 sugere que pode trazer prejuízos no valor de 44 milhões de dólares durante o ciclo de vida do projeto. E o segundo estudo é do Standard Bank, que assume que os pagamentos dos impostos por parte do projeto LNG serão utilizados, entre outras coisas, para reembolsar 50% da dívida da ENH contraída para financiar as participações nos projetos. Isso significa que o governo deve optar por utilizar parte das suas receitas fiscais para este efeito, deixando de lado outras prioridades. E o terceiro ponto, também que nos chama muito a atenção, é o atraso ou esta estagnação da instalação da alta autoridade da indústria extrativa. Como muito bem o professor Novunga referenciava, o nosso país ele tem um histórico de má gestão de fundos públicos. E com este braço direito, essa certa resistência, dá-nos a entender que, de facto, não há vontade política de poder abrir espaço para uma gestão mais transparente e mais sustentável dos recursos provenientes da exploração de hidrocarbonetos. E o último aspecto, o quarto que eu gostaria mesmo de fazer menção, tem a ver com a incerteza do modelo de fundo soberano que o Estado possa vir a adotar. Uma das coisas que sugere, na verdade, que concordamos sim com o Centro para a Democracia e Desenvolvimento, é que o fundo soberano seja ele um fundo híbrido. Aceitamos que olhe mais para a questão da estabilidade econômica e também a poupança das gerações vindouras, dos fundos para as gerações vindouras. Mas que esta gestão deste fundo seja, na verdade, uma gestão transparente, e onde a gente já começa a trazer, vem a nossa maior preocupação, a questão da transparência da gestão desses fundos. Mais ou menos são estes pontos que gostaria de fazer menção, que, de certa forma, o professor Will traz aqui, e é muito gratificante trazer uma experiência. Passo a palavra para o professor Novunga. Não tenho questões como tal. Comentários. Desculpe.
Está no mute, professor Novunga.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Thank you very much, all of you, for your comments, for your remarks. We have simultaneous translation. I believe Professor Hourt followed your questions and comments, and he will address some of these comments and questions, reflecting now on the possibilities. As I've said in my earlier intervention, you know Mozambique very well. You have led a program aimed at improving the quality of governance in the higher institutions, tertiary education. That was a successful program, but you know the problems we're facing. As I said, aid was cut not because Mozambique has graduated due to levels of development, but it was cut because of bad governance, because of corruption. And it is true that Suriname, it's a sort of city-state with only 500,000 people. But there are countries in Africa. You have Equatorial Guinea here, which is not as rich as, which is way much richer compared to Suriname. But the overwhelming majority of the population has no food to drink. And they have been exploring oil before I was born, some 40 years back. So I'd like to ask you to reflect on these issues, focusing on what made a difference. What was the game changer for the Surinamese to move? What has the issue of political will? But could you please unpack that? Could you please go a bit deeper? Because this is exactly what we are looking for. The pockets of efficiency are not only about technicalities, technical capacity. They are more importantly about political decisions. Where will that decision come from in the Mozambique and African context? Professor Hourt, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you again, and thanks also for all the observations, and to the extent that they focus directly on the Mozambican context. A lot of the things that were mentioned, I don't know very much about, and obviously Novunga is much too generous to say that I have big expertise in Mozambique. But let me try to say a couple of things. But now there is a strange noise on the line somewhere. So maybe the technician could do something about that. So I'm seeming to hear all kinds of strange noises. Yeah, one of the key elements that I think I should again bring forward is that if we look at the experience of Suriname and the figures may here, the figures that were also presented comparing Mozambique to Suriname may lead us into a different discussion. This is not a developmental state. My argument from the outside has been this is very much a non-developmental context. The point is that a lot of the resources, and it's very often mentioned, Suriname, if you look at World Bank figures, is number 17 on the list of countries with natural resource abundance. A lot of these resources have actually not been used for productive purposes. So that's at the background of my analysis of the country. The point is that I see that despite this situation, this particular oil company has been able to flourish. And my analysis was not brought in so much to say this is a recipe for other countries to follow. Now, this is an example of how even in particularly bad contexts, something might work out. And that is where I used the term pockets of efficiency or pockets of effectiveness. In the first intervention, Navunga already pointed to the notion of embedded autonomy, which is a term coined by Peter Evans, which focuses very much on the relationship between state and society. And so if we look at development experiences, one of the keys is how is the relationship between state and society. And it was from the analysis that Evans did in his book Dependent Development of 1979, which draws very much on the Brazilian experience, that he coined the term pocket of effectiveness. And so he came up, he did an analysis of this Brazilian National Development Bank, which under a particular government in the 1960s was sorry, I have this awful noise. I have to take out my headset because I can't talk and hear that at the same time. So this notion of pocket of effectiveness was coined by Peter Evans on the basis of the analysis of the Brazilian experience. And what he said was, at some stage, the specific Brazilian government gave particular powers to the leadership of this Brazilian National Development Bank to implement particular policies. And they gave them basically a free hand, and the then government shielded off the development bank from political interference. And they recruited people with a background in public finance, in economics, etc. And they basically made them into an independent body. Now, this is an analysis which is very interesting in the context of Brazil. This is not the situation I want to emphasize that I found in Suriname. The whole genesis, and that answers directly to the questions that were raised by Dr. Joel, the whole experience of the creation of this company was very different. So this was not, let's say, a decision of sort of enlightened leaders who said, well, here you have the opportunity to build a national oil company and do whatever you want. And this was not the context. Actually, you might say that the oil company came about more or less by chance. And the situation was in the 1980s, as I said, Jarab a geologist trained in the Netherlands, had more or less by chance discovered a source of oil. And he, on the basis of his training, he thought, if there is one source in one place, there must be more oil here. And of course, he knew the experience also of neighboring countries where by that time also oil had been found. So he was convinced that there was more oil. But he was the only one basically believing in this. And so in that sense, I say this was more or less by chance. And he found himself as a very dedicated, very leftist manager. Right? So he was a member of the then existing People's Party of Suriname, which was a sort of a Maoist type of political party that very much believed in the notion of self-reliance. So he had access to the then military rulers, and he convinced them, let's create an oil commission. And the oil commission will be tasked with exploring oil sources in the countryside. So he was tasked with that, and he got a mandate. And it was then later that he set up a company. He convinced the leadership that this should be a company set up as a limited company, so that it would be independent from the government. He used the argument also, maybe you should give me that limited company so that you wouldn't be burdened with any losses that I would run. So it was that kind of argument. And so he ended up with this company that actually had two main tasks. One was it was tasked with actually exploring oil as sort of an oil company, but secondly, it was tasked with the role of what is called the agent of the state. So it got the possibility, wherever oil would be found, to act in the name of the state vis-a-vis foreign oil companies. And actually, so ironically, that very same role, that legal position that he managed to secure in 1980, when there was hardly a drop of oil found, benefited the company in 2020, when effectively oil was discovered in the continental shelf, and this company started to negotiate. They made this production sharing agreement with Apache and Total. So it was clear that whatever would be found in the soil of the country would remain the property and would remain national property. So it would not be transferred as in a concession to a third party. And I think that's been this sort of brilliant idea that, of course, could have turned out into a major disaster, because if nothing had come of this, it might not have benefited the country at all. But then a lot of what came next. So this is the story of the first 2, 3, 4 years, where there was minimal oil produced, where actually the oil commission and the later company were tasked with particular duties and responsibilities. But a lot of what followed between, let's say, 1984 and 2005 was highly path dependent. It was highly dependent on the decisions that were made in the first period. So that I would say is due to the leadership of the then management of this company, because they succeeded in using using the space that they got. They succeeded in not becoming dependent on public money. So as I said, they borrowed money. Actually, they had a sort of a revolving loan agreement with the ABN AMRO Bank in Houston. And so not in the Netherlands, because that was too politically sensitive, because then you would become dependent on your former colonizer. No, it was ABN AMRO in Houston, and they got this revolving loan agreement. And so whenever they earned money, they paid back part of the loan, and they could draw on that same agreement at a later stage to make investments. So I think that was the leadership component. But then, had it not been for the social support, and this ties in a lot of the other comments, including about civil society, about counterweight, etc. Had it not been for social support, then probably the company also would not have survived. I told you about the massive demonstration. Massive here is, tens of thousands of people on this Independence Square. So this is a small country, so 20 or 30,000 people is already quite a significant portion of the population. But they assembled on the square, and they basically said to the then government, this is enough. We don't want this. This is a successful company, and you should keep your hands off that company and should not try to sell it, because we know you are corrupt. That was very much in the public discussion at the moment. So this whole notion of corruption that also Navunga referred to earlier, that was being put on the table, and that was being used as a measure to get this public support and to show actually that there was a lot of resistance against possible decisions made by the government. So I think it is those two types of things. On the one hand, it's the legal independence, and that was used and used to its full potential. But on the other hand, it was also this strategy of building social support. And then with regard to, there were also some other questions about the significance. And so I think one of the major important things linked to this oil company is not so much that it provided revenues. By the way, I just looked up, and in 2010, when I did interviews with the then leadership of the company, I think they indicated that roughly 20% of the total government revenue came from the state oil company. So this was really what was then called the goose with the golden eggs. And it was also clear that when this company was not able to operate as it had in the period before, that the government might endanger this goose with the golden eggs. And so it would not produce these golden eggs anymore. So that was also a major part in the restraint of the government. And I wouldn't call it leadership on the part of the government, but it was a restraint because they saw that this well-functioning state company would bring in a significant part of total government revenues. But that is important. Of course, politically, that's very important. And politically also that showed a series of governments that letting the company do what it could do best would also benefit the government directly. And so that's important. But more importantly, probably, is that a lot of the investment that was done over time was used actually for diversification. And so that's why I mentioned the building of the refinery, the investment in relatively high tech, particularly for that environment, where the refinery is now able to produce the high-end products, but also its involvement in electricity production, in hydropower, and a lot of other things. That, I think, is a very important element. Now then, so this all adds up. You could say it's a sort of a balance sheet. But then what's under the line, and then let me come back to Nuvunga's, I think, underlying question, because I think there's an underlying question in what you were saying at the very beginning. And that has to do with transferability. Now, is this transferable? Is this experience transferable to different contexts? Interestingly, there's literature now on the African experience from at least two angles. One is the angle of the traditional developmental state literature, where there is an emphasis on experience of a number of countries, Botswana, Mauritius, and a number of others. Here, the argument is there are examples of countries that have instituted institutions that succeed in using natural resource revenues in a productive way. And so these are a couple of the examples. There's another line in the literature, and that came out of a research program initiated by the Overseas Development Institute in London, the African Power and Politics program, which talks about developmental neo-patrimonialism. And that focuses on the experience of countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia. And then they say, okay, here you see, yes, countries that on the one hand have demonstrated to be highly patrimonial, there are clear patronage relationships, but on the other hand, they succeed in mobilizing resources to invest in developmental activities. The bulk of this work came out, let's say 2013, 2014, when the real discourse of the Ethiopian democratic developmental state was still very much alive. I'm not so sure about the experience anymore in 2019, 2020. Of course, we saw all the difficulties in Ethiopia, but we also saw how actually the Ethiopian state had been using, and maybe this is the same, at least from what I know, also through Nuvunga's work for Mozambique, on how actually all kinds of benefits are used to support the position of those in power. So, yeah, with regard to transferability, I'm actually of two minds. On the one hand, I see indeed there are all kinds of possibilities. If you have the type of leadership that is able and willing, and I think it actually is both. It's not just being willing, it's also able. And so you need to have that, and maybe here I should use the same term that Nuvunga used in the beginning, embedded autonomy. You need to be at least so autonomous that you can take particular types of decisions. So it is not only about willingness, it's also about ability. And maybe under those situations, a particular relatively independent sovereign wealth fund with particular developmental institutions could be created. But I think personally, and I see also that from the experience, for instance, from Suriname, here is also where you need to have sufficient social pressure. So there has to be an active civil society that can press for the independence of those institutions. So yeah, that's what I could say with regard to transferability, and that is actually not that much. So it depends on a number of conditions. On the one hand, leadership. On the other hand, and that component is a combination of willingness and ability, and also the type of social balancing, the social counterweight that can be mobilized to indeed hold those in power accountable. So maybe that sums it up. Tonavunga, I think it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Will, for those comments and clarifications, and particularly on the issue of transferability. Is it transferable? Is it the success? It is interesting that you have indicated that the Surinamese, when they discovered oil, they said they would be the new Qatar. Mozambique did the same. The president at the time here, Mr. Armando Milugebuza, he organized a conference, Africa Rising, with the IMF. And the then director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, she was here, and she was hailing Mozambique as the new Qatar of Africa. It has been 7 years now. Mozambique is in default. It cannot pay the basics. People are starving, no medication. And with COVID-19, they couldn't buy even a simple paracetamol for the people here. They have to go back to the IMF to borrow, again, against future revenues. And the war there is sitting in between the Mozambique people to harness that resource in Cabo Delgado. You are aware of the notion of resource caps. But Mozambique is facing a pre-source caps. So a caps even before the production starts. And wondering whether that wealth, which is sitting deep sea in northern Mozambique, will ever be turned into prosperity, into inclusive and shared prosperity for the people of this country. The reason is simple: bad governance, bad leadership. It is bad leadership. It is bad leadership that has taken the country to where it is now. And the question is of whether it is transferable, the success of the Surinamese. I will ask my discussants for one more round of quick questions. We have only 10 minutes, so I'll give 1 minute to each of you. Dr. Mblalango, 1 minute.
Sim, doutor Nuvunga. Primeiro, queria abordar algumas questões que foram aqui levantadas também. Queria, de forma resumida, sobre a questão do financiamento, que foi levantado pelo colega Agostinho. Queria dizer que a questão do care por parte, chama-se care por parte das outras concessionárias, é uma obrigatoriedade legal, que vem no próprio contrato de concessão. Portanto, as concessionárias são obrigadas, na fase de pesquisa, a suportarem todos os gastos que a empresa pública, que representa os interesses do Estado, deve suportar mediante um reembolso através das receitas oferidas com parte da produção que lhe cabe. Portanto, nós aqui estamos a dizer que o Estado não incorre riscos na fase de pesquisa. Mas o mesmo não acontece relativamente à parte, quanto à fase de desenvolvimento. Porque na fase de desenvolvimento, o financiamento deve-se recorrer a empréstimos. E por via disso, cada um deve fazer empréstimo.
Yeah, I'll have to stop you. 1 minute for each. 1 minute. One minute. You can conclude. 1 minute.
Ok. Então, eu dizia que é importante a fase de desenvolvimento a questão de que a empresa de accountability, de prestação de contas, penso que a própria legislação já diz isso nos seus, o decreto que me referi, 29 para 2015, no seu artigo 24, no seu artigo 27, a própria empresa tem que ter um contrato-programa e ela também deve publicar os seus relatórios no Boletim da República, como uma forma de todos saberem como é que está a ser gerido o braço empresarial do Estado. E penso que, em termos de tanto legais para a prestação de contas como de funcionamento, no caso de Moçambique, não ouvi sobre o Suriname relativamente a esta questão de como é estabelecida a própria empresa, se ela tem termos de referência que obrigam a uma prestação de contas que evite influência de terceiros. Penso que é isto. Se nós formos a ver, quanto a Moçambique, essas questões estão minimamente salvaguardadas na lei. Obrigado.
Thank you, Dr. Mblalango. Dr. Marcelina as well.
Thank you very much. I think I have to thank again Professor Will for the clarification on the questions, but I feel that I shall clarify some of the comments made by, I think it's Dr. Mosei Subuta, on the silence from the government side on this establishing or implementing the high authority that was set it up through the mining law in 2014. I think what I can say is that the articles of association or the bylaws, if you want, of that high authority, it is ready. It is now lying at the cabinet, waiting for the approval. And we believe that it will be approved at the end time. But it is controversial as well, because from the civil society side, they don't agree on the legal nature of this high authority, because they think it shouldn't report to the government, to the cabinet. It should report to the parliament. So for that, we have to go back to the parliament and change the law so that we can have a different legal nature of that authority. That is what I think I can clarify. Regarding the Mozambique to set up the sovereign fund, I think I have to thank Dr. Nuvunga for this webinars, international webinar series of webinars, because we have learned a lot. And as I said, Mozambique is engaged in this process, so that if that resource once come, at least we'll be prepared on how to manage it, and we'll set up the proper legal framework. Thank you very much.
Dr. Siuta, 1 minute.
Well, thank you. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Will for your presentation and the clarification of the questions. And my point is, I think this seminar should be continued in the next stage, because I have the feeling that in this conversation we focused on how the company and the government are related. But we should remember that the aim of this discussion is how development can come through the exploitation of natural resources. And there is a need to discuss how the government of Suriname, for example, manages their resources in order to develop the country, and establish a link between government and government management of the fiscal resources in order to make the country grow and develop by improving the welfare of its people. So that is my point, and well, I cannot make questions because time is out. Yes.
Okay. Time is out. Yes. Doutor Agostinho Viana, 30 segundos.
Muito obrigado pela palavra, mas queria agradecer mais uma vez ao professor Will e deixar ficar mesmo aquela que é a nossa grande preocupação de como é que os ganhos resultantes ou provenientes da exploração dos recursos minerais, concretamente os hidrocarbonetos, poderão ajudar a reduzir as assimetrias socioespaciais e, com isso, também não frustrar aquelas que são expectativas das comunidades locais. Esse é o nosso grande desejo, o grande desafio que temos, e encorajar mais uma vez para que foros desta natureza sejam ainda levados a cabo e que esgotemos os nossos debates em torno do setor extrativo. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much to all of you. Professor Will Hourt, over to you for the final comments. 2 minutes, if possible. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. One thing that I want to add towards the end is that if we're talking about Suriname, this is not, I would say, an example of economic success. So particularly over the last couple of years, economic situation has deteriorated. They've entered into massive borrowing. They have recently devaluated the currency by about 100% overnight. So this is a country in dire straits at the moment. A glimmer of hope, I would say, is a couple of well-managed companies like the State Oil Company. But overall, I don't think this is a situation that creates a lot of hope. I would say the resource curse is around the corner. Also there, because of the well-endowed natural resource base, this is a constant fear, and it remains a fear. One final thing, if I understand it well, the discussions are undergoing about a high authority for natural resources in Mozambique. I think indeed a vital thing is an independent, to create an independent high authority. Because that will be the major actor in giving out I don't know. I don't hope it will be concessions, because I think that in the end is a very bad model. But if there are agreements with private sector companies, that is the body that's going to regulate it. And if you have a body that is too close to the government, then that will be a major source for disaster. And when Navunga is talking about bad governance and corruption and misuse of public funds, I mean, this is a recipe. So a high authority that is very dependent on the government and where actually the government can interfere, that is a recipe for disaster. Okay, that's, I think, my 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Professor. Recipe for disaster is indeed where we are today. It's indeed where we are today. As I've said, we are experiencing resource scarce. And with COVID-19, government quickly went borrowing, not using that money, and that will pile up the debt and the fiscal distress of the country. I haven't seen thus far any convincing discussions for a way out. I haven't seen convincing discussions for a way out. We hope to bring in this platform entry points for a robust and meaningful discussion as to how the country could not only harness the existing wealth in the north, but also, and importantly, improve fiscal transparency and also protect, have to shield some of the potential game changers for the country, as is the case of our revenues from the world-class gas reserves in northern Mozambique, and the possibilities of turning ANH, our national oil company here, into a profitable company for the benefit of the country, and use all that to stabilize the economy and catalyze good governance. That's our hope. I thank you, all of you. I thank you, Professor Hourt. I thank the International Institute of Social Studies that agreed to partner with us. In fact, we have been working with the Institute since I graduated from my PhD. With your supervision, Professor Hourt as my PhD supervisor, I thank you for that. And having the opportunity to keep the good collaboration with the Institute and with you, it is indeed a signal that those ties, that investment from Norfolk, it was a successful investment. So I thank you very much. I thank you, the people of Netherlands, the people of Suriname, for enduring these challenges and being out there, from whom we are learning today. I thank you, my colleagues. I thank you, Dr. Marcelina, as well. I thank you, Anibal Mblalango. I thank you, Dr. C. People of this country and for the continent. I thank you. We end here and see you next Thursday in the next session. And the next speaker is Todd Moss. Todd Moss is a US-based expert in wealth sovereign fund. Thank you. See you in 7 days over today. Have a good rest of the day, and thank you to everyone.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. Yeah.